Hello, and welcome to The Diseased and the Dead, a talk on Ammonite pathologies. My name's Richard, and I'm going to guide you through some of my favourite pathologies and the insights they offer into ammonites, lifestyles, and their abilities in life. Everybody agrees that ammonites can be seen as objects of beauty. You'll see them used as ornaments, as wall decorations, even turned into jewellery, necklaces for example. And yeah, I agree they are things of beauty, whether it's the ribbon patterns or the braided keels of the amaltheid family. We all agree that they are beautiful objects, but there's so much more we can learn from the ones that are not perfect, as we're going to see. To date, there have been some 44 different pathologies named, and in this talk, I'm not going to go through all of them. That would be far too boring for both you and me. Instead, I'm going to pick out some of my favourites, tell you about them and the insights they offer into ammonites as living animals. The naming convention of a pathology is to label them as forma agra, followed by a name that indicates what the structure of the pathology is. There has been some debate about whether to drop the agra part of the name, as agra just indicates sick, and by labelling it as a forma to start with, you are already indicating that this is a sick and diseased animal. However, for now, the forma agra designation sticks. In the previous slide, you saw a table of ammonite pathologies in the book I photographed to show you that list. An amusing tale there. My local branch of Waterstones were very pleased with me the day I bought that. They hit their sales target for the day in one single sale with me buying that book, and it will set you back a three-figure sum. However, when it comes to pathologies for ammonites and other extinct cephalopods, this is the go-to book. I would heartily recommend it, even though I can't speak German, but it's an absolute goldmine of information. In this particular ammonite, an example of Hildocerus bifrons, is showing the most recently named pathology, forma agra genusa. If you're familiar with Roman mythology, you may have heard of the god Janus, who gives us our name January for the first month of the year. He's depicted as a two-faced god, one face facing forwards, one facing backwards, and is the god of doorways and beginnings and endings. And you can see in this particular specimen that one side looks like a completely normal Hildocerus with the ribs and the groove as you would expect, but the other side looks like a Grammocerus. And I think these are fantastic specimens for showing how plastic ammonite biology was, in that this same animal is displaying two different ribbon patterns on opposite sides, and this gives us an insight into how easily ammonites could have evolved and changed their ribbon patterns. Okay, this is a lovely specimen of Perinoceras fibulatum. It's experienced a pathology called forma agra undata sparata, which means something like a wandering spiral. And as you can see from the side, it looks like a perfectly normal specimen of Perinoceras. But when you look at it from the keel and the aperture there, you can see that it's rather wonky. That instead of forming the perfectly straight line you would expect, it's tilted to one side. And this shows that in life, another creature, perhaps a bivalve of some kind, had attached itself to the ammonite, unbalancing it, causing it to grow lopsided in an effort to rebalance itself. Hence, we have this lopsided appearing ammonite. And I think this offers great insights into how an ammonite could adapt its growth to deal with the things it encountered in life. Okay. A specimen of Dactylorus athleticum for you from Whitby. This particular one, forma agra verticata, you can see from the arrow where the start of the damage is, and in this case something has attacked the ammonite when the shell had only grown this far, damaging the mantle, which is the shell producing part of the body in cephalopods, and it's left some permanent damage, as you can see, because the ribs change the angle that they're at, but we've also got this scar here, which is what the verticata part of the name refers to, which continues right around the spiral until the point where growth has stopped in this particular case. That indicates there was some permanent damage to the shell producing part, which left this permanent trail as it effectively dragged behind the rest of the mantle, creating the scar we can see. This particular one doesn't have a formal IGRA name, it's just known as serpulid encrustation, and this is an example of Promicrosus from Dorset. You can see if you look closer that there's a serpulid worm tube attached to it that's grown around the venter, and it's grown as the ammonite has grown. The great thing about these is serpulid worms are still alive today, so we know their growth rates, and that allows us to look at a specimen like this because the worm kept the mouth of its tube at a constant angle relative to the ammonite's aperture, meaning that as we know the growth rate of serpulids today, we can then begin to calculate the growth rate of an ammonite like this. This particular example of Dactylorhynchus has to be my personal favourite pathology, mainly because it was the first pathological ammonite I ever managed to find up at Saltic Bay. This pathology is known as formal IGRA substructure, and in this case the ammonite has been attacked. The shell at this point has been broken clean away from the rest of the phragmocone, but the ammonite has actually survived the attack and has been able to pull its body back into the shell to this point and then create new shell growth that starts underneath the original shell and then continues outwards all the way around to its new aperture. But as you can see from the misaligned ribs at this point, it's unable to match the ribbing pattern of the original. But this is a fantastic example of an ammonite that's been attacked but survived the attack. And not only that, it shows how well they could regrow the shell when required, but also in this case it indicates just how far into the shell the ammonite was able to withdraw its body. In this case, Dactylorhynchus, it was over 180 degrees that they could retract the body in order to repair the damage done to the shell by the predator. So I just love specimens like this as they tell us to have a story to tell. So far in this talk, we've only looked at the diseased part, the pathologies. Now we're going to turn our attention to the dead. Now, strictly speaking, this isn't a pathology, as it's not the response of a living animal to injury or disease. But however, these are also quite fascinating. As you can see from these specimens, they both have damage to the shell opposite the aperture, and this, technically a trace fossil, has been given the rather glorious tongue twister of Bicresco mangicator roli as its name. I've done quite well there. I managed to say that without tripping over my own tongue for once. Sometimes people don't tell you just how much luck there can be in paleontology, but it's certainly true in this case. Back in 2012, I was lucky enough to find a bitten ammonite at Saltic Bay, but I would have thrown it away as a damaged one, not bothered collecting it. However, just the night before, in this particular issue of the Proceedings of the Yorkshire Geological Society, I'd read an article on bitten ammonites from Lyme Regis and had been quite intrigued by it, and had noticed the pattern on the ammonites, the damage opposite the aperture, and then the day after, Saltic Bay, less than 24 hours later, I picked one up, something in my head clicked and looked at it and went, this could be one of those bitten ones. And just goes to show how much luck there can be involved, because if I hadn't read the paper the night before, I would have just put it back as a damaged one. And luckily, I recognised what it was, took it home, and it turned out to be the first bitten ammonite recorded from the Lower Jurassic of Yorkshire. And this is the specimen in question. It's an example of Dactylorhynchus. At the time I wrote the paper, I wasn't confident in identifying whether it was Communia and Athleticum, which is why it's labelled as Dactylorhynchus sp, but it was found at Saltic Bay, and you can see the characteristic U-shaped damage there opposite the aperture. And in the next few slides I'll explain why we think this is a trace fossil caused by predation. Okay, when you find a damaged ammonite, like the example shown, you've got to rule out possible different causes before you can claim it's predation damage. The first and most obvious one is it damage post-exposure after the specimen's been eroded out from the cliffs or the beach? And while that is possible, and indeed I've seen specimens that people have presented to me claiming that they're bitten, but when you look at them, although they do have the characteristic semicircular damage, That semicircle continues on into the nodule around it, clearly showing that the nodule itself has broken thanks to some kind of damage being rolled around on the beach and taken a chunk of the ammonite with it. So in some cases we can say, no, it's definitely not bitten. But in others, the nodule around it is intact, and yet you still have that characteristic U-shaped semicircular damage to them. Another cause that's been suggested is what's been termed post-mortem blowout, which sometimes sounds like a bit of a party to me. But that aside, the suggestion is that decomposition gases are built up inside the shell to the point where they've then caused the shell to erupt or to break outwards, leaving that characteristic hole. And it's suggested that this happens just in front of the last septum. Now, just a couple of problems with that I feel. One of them is that if decomposition gases are indeed building up, why wouldn't they just erupt out of the easiest possible point, the aperture, where there's already an opening for them to escape through? The other problem that's noted is that the damage is always around 180 degrees from the aperture on average. Yet if it was decomposition gases causing a blowout in front of the last septum, the damage should vary by genus. For example, in Dactylornis, the back of the body chamber, the last septum, is 360 degrees from the aperture. In a genus like Cleviceras, it's about 90 degrees, and in a genus like Promicroceras, the back of the body chamber is 180 degrees from the aperture. So if it was decomposition gases causing a post-mortem blowout, you would expect the location of the damage to vary by genus, and it doesn't. It's always about the 180 degree mark. And intriguingly, there's been a damaged nautilus reported from Lyme Regis recently. The paper's been published, I think, earlier this year, if I remember right. And in that particular example, the body chamber is missing completely, yet the purported predator has attacked this nautilus, rotated it so that the opening of the shell, which remember there's no body chamber, so no soft body to eat, is opposite the mouth, and it's then bitten through the phragmocone at 180 degrees from what it perceived as the aperture. Yet it was a futile attempt because there was no soft body to eat. But as I say, intriguingly, we're seeing the same pattern even on a shell that did not have anything to eat and no body chamber, therefore decomposition gases can't have erupted from the back of it, and yet the damage is again at the 180 degree point. Which of course brings us to the last option, damage in life. Now, on the previous slide, I mentioned that the damage is consistent in its location about 180 degrees from the aperture. And here you can see an example of Dactylornis, the second specimen I found at Saltwick Bay. And by the way, both of these are now on display in the Yorkshire Museum, as you'll see. And this is how we calculate where the location of the damage is. There's the aperture, there's the damage, so you locate the midpoint of the damage and then measure the angle from the aperture to the midpoint. And as I said on the previous slide, this consistently comes out at around about 180 degrees. And yet, as you can see in this specimen, the back of the body chamber is right around here. I've just mentioned that those two Dactylornis specimens are on display in the Yorkshire Museum, and you can just on this photograph see them there under the squid's tentacles. And they've put this together, this rather nice little diorama of a squid attacking the Dactylornis. You can just see one of them there, and I think the other one's somewhere around here, showing what we think is a suspected predator, the culprit. The reason why the attack will be about 180 degrees from the aperture is in the typical ammonite, that's where the muscles that hold the soft bodied ammonite into its shell would be fastened onto the shell. So by biting through at that point, those muscles would be severed, enabling the attacker to pull the ammonite's soft body out and then eat it. The reason why people suspect it's a squid of some sort, or possibly a belemnite, or perhaps a vampire squid like Loliga sepia, is that whatever the predator was, it had to be something that could consistently attack an ammonite and rotate it and hold it while biting through at that point 180 degrees from the aperture. Now, as you'll realise, that requires some dexterity and also some intelligence to find and locate the same area all the time. The other thing that's been observed about that angle is it would mean approaching the ammonite from behind or above, possibly a blind spot for them. But who knows without getting a time machine to be able to watch that one. So hopefully by now you'll have found some of these pathologies interesting in the insights they offer to ammonite lives and their ability to regrow their shells and the like and survive injury. But I'm just going to leave you with two little puzzles. This is another specimen from Saltic Bay, and again you can see the characteristic damage there, the U-shape, but in this particular case it's more like 270 degrees, almost 300 degrees from the aperture, and the damage is there, but it's the wrong location. And intriguingly, whatever's happened with this one, we've got this very dark pyritic mass of rock there that was hard enough to actually break the point in the hairpin when I was prepping this. So it's a bit of a puzzle what happened to this one. Did something attack it, get it wrong, but the ammonite survived and then died from its injuries? Or was the ammonite actually killed by this, but then the predator failed to complete its attack? Who knows? It's a bit of a mystery. One day I hope to be able to scan this and find out just what the different colour of rock signifies, if anything. But until then, I'll have to leave that one as a puzzle. Another final puzzle to leave you with. When you look at the German specimens of bitten ammonites and the examples from Dorset as reported in Andrew et al.'s paper, when you look at them in some horizons and indeed in some nodules, you can see as many of 20% of the ammonites show that characteristic damage to the venter at 180 degrees from the aperture. That's something that hasn't been seen yet so far in Yorkshire. There are bitten ammonites about, the ones reported in this talk and in the matching paper, and some reported from the Middle Jurassic that you can find in the Proceedings of the Yorkshire Geological Society. But there's nothing like this 20% rate of damaged ones that we've seen in Dorset. And that presents a bit of a puzzle. Is it because of size? Is it because the different genre are about? Is it because the predators were rarer? It's a bit hard to say. I mean, it has been noted that the Dactylorhynchus shown in this talk that were both bitten are at the upper size range for examples of bitten and predated ammonites. But while that would protect the adults, it doesn't explain, for example, why the smaller genre don't display this damage, or indeed why the juveniles don't display this damage, because after all, they couldn't rely on size for protection in the way that the adults could. So, as I said, that's a mystery to be explained. I'm still working on it, going out and collecting Dactylorhynchus, Hilldorhynchus and other ammonites to see if I can work it out. And if I do, I will let you know. So I hope you've enjoyed this talk and you've gained some insight into ammonite biology and their ability to deal with pathologies and injuries. Thank you for listening.